With this, we welcome the next speaker, who is Eunice Yoon. She is an assistant professor of computer science at UCLA, and her research enhances how researchers and policymakers analyze and use data. She obtained her PhD from the University of Washington, where she was part of the Interactive Data Lab and the Programming Languages and Software Engineering Group. And her work has been recognized by a number of institutions, such as the NSF GRFP or the Paper Awards at the ACM CHI or the Berry Groundwater Foundation. With this, we would like to welcome Eunice Yoon.
Thank you. Great. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, awesome, great. So as a computer science researcher who specializes in human-computer interaction, I'm particularly interested in how we can take statistical best practices and recommendations and make them approachable and usable to end users in the real world. And to do so, I developed tools that not only scaffold or guide the statistical modeling process, but also provide guarantees about the output statistical models from the software tools themselves. So in the last several years, the reproducibility crises in a number of scientific disciplines has really inspired and motivated my research. And to many of us in this room, it's probably no surprise that in a recent Nature survey of 1,500 scientists, the vast majority of scientists agreed that there was a reproducibility crisis in their discipline and that they themselves had failed to reproduce a published result. On a much smaller scale, there have been additional papers that have been published where highly skilled analysts who have both domain expertise and statistical expertise are given the same research question and data set and asked to answer that research question. And oftentimes, these researchers and analysts will arrive at not only differing conclusions, but sometimes even contradictory ones. So what could be happening or contributing to these things? So scholars and statisticians have attributed selective reporting as a potential cause of irreproducible findings, as many of the speakers earlier today have already talked about. And selective reporting is a problem not just because analysts explore a garden of forking paths, but they also just don't necessarily report the key assumptions or key decisions that they've made when arriving at their analyses, in particular if they only select one to report in their manuscripts. In response, others have proposed this new paradigm of authoring analyses called multiverse analysis, where analysts specify specific analysis decision points, all options at each of those analysis decision points, explore an entire space of a number of different paths, and then report on the results collectively. As you can imagine, a key challenge with multiverse analysis is that there's just a large number of possible analysis decisions and options, and then you can imagine the combinatorial explosion of all of those options as we go forward. So to address this key authoring challenge, my former colleagues at the University of Washington, Yang Liu, Alex Kale, Tim Althoff, and Jeff Hare contributed BOBA. And BOBA consists of a domain-specific language, or DSL, as well as a visualization interface to interpret the multiverse analysis results. So there are a number of important details in the open source code on GitHub, but here, for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight a few key design decisions. So the first on the left-hand side is an R script using BOBA. And importantly, BOBA is designed to be language agnostic, so we can use BOBA with R, Python, Julia, whatever your favorite language is. And there are three key decision blocks. So the top is a shared block for filtering data, and the bottom two decision blocks are different statistical models. So the second one is a linear model, and the third decision block is a linear mixed effects model. In the top and third blocks, there are these important decision options in curly braces, as highlighted here in blue. So for example, we might be able to filter on either the value 0 or 0.6, and then for the linear mixed effects model, there can be different random effect structures we're interested in. So the goal of BOBA is to allow an analyst to specify these options and then arrive at a set of possible analysis paths, which are summarized on the right-hand side in this table. And importantly, each row specifies a script where there's actually just one cutoff value, a random effects structure if necessary, and a specific linear model. So to make things really concrete, if we were to look at the second model, so here 2.R, we see this R script that we can run that uses the cutoff value of 0.6 and a linear model without any mixed effects. Once analysts have a set of possible analysis paths or universes, they can then visualize the results in BOBA's visualization interface, as shown here. So here's the central visualization that shows the different point estimates for all of the different analysis paths or universes in orange. And once you hover over them, then you see the uncertainty distribution for each analysis path. And then if we want to observe how different analysis decisions influence the outcome, here this coefficient that we care about, then we can actually shift click and add different decision points, and we'll add dimensions to the central trellis plot. If we're wanting to then observe and understand model quality, then we can actually see the observed and predicted outcomes on this right-hand panel. And by actually hovering over specific analysis paths in this middle area, we can actually see the different model predictions on the right-hand side and then filter based on model quality. So then once we're happy with a specific set of models that we then want to perform inference on, we can perform inference, and Boba will provide a summary view on the top of the multiverse analysis, and then underneath, all the individual universes are visualized for the end user to be able to read and understand how they contributed to the overall result. So once Boba was released, one of the things we observed was that what makes authoring multiverse analyses difficult is the fact that we have to debug all of the possible analysis paths. And that becomes more complicated and more time-consuming just because we have so many possible options to consider. And so in response, Ken Gu, Tim Althoff, and I developed Multiverse Debugger. And Multiverse Debugger is a command line interface tool that takes as input a Boba specification and provides as output the analysis scripts, plus a number of important interactive features for debugging that multiverse. And so first, one is an aggregation of the common errors across the entire multiverse. So by quickly diagnosing possible bugs, we can stop the running of the multiverse analysis and allow the analyst to then fix a specific analysis bug that then gets propagated to the entire multiverse analysis in the second interface. So while Boba and Multiverse Debugger have definitely lowered the engineering barriers to authoring multiverse analysis, there actually remains a more fundamental problem, which is how does a domain expert even articulate a single model that they consider to be reasonable, let alone a space of all possible analyses and options for all those decision points? And so in some ongoing work, we're really looking at how we can provide end users with tools that enable them to author valid statistical models. And we're going to really leverage this key idea and insight that we can do so by allowing them to articulate their domain knowledge and use that to actually compile statistical models. And the goal of this work is such that we can provide an on-ramp from a single statistical model to a space of possible statistical models in the future for multiverse analysis or for PCS, for example. So one example system I'm going to talk about is Artisan, and then I'll conclude with some ongoing work. So just to really set some context, the kinds of analysts or end users that we're trying to support here are domain experts in areas outside of statistics. And at the heart of what makes statistical analysis difficult is that we need to do two key tasks. So for example, if we wanted to actually answer this research question of what aspects of an individual's background and demographics influence income after they've graduated from high school, analysts need to be able to grapple with their domain knowledge and then figure out how they then can translate that domain knowledge and represent it statistically in a statistical model. And one common way in which we can represent domain knowledge is as a conceptual model. So here's a conceptual model that an analyst or researcher in one of our lab studies actually drew. And the key thing about these kinds of conceptual models is that they contain really important information about variables of interest in our domain and relationships between those variables. And we can think about these conceptual models as informal causal diagrams, or what maybe Richard Rickalreth describes as process models, or just generally assumptions we make about the underlying data generating process. Unfortunately, existing software tools for authoring statistical analyses in languages like R and Python provide a lot of support for low-level APIs that have a lot of mathematical expressivity and computational control, but that comes at the cost of actually providing support for conceptual modeling and for connecting conceptual models to the statistical models. At the same time, there's another class of software tools like Dagity that are really focused on conceptual modeling, but then that translation from a conceptual model to a statistical model is left to the analyst. And more importantly, a key assumption that these kinds of software tools make is that analysts are not only domain experts, but also statistical experts who feel comfortable reasoning about and expressing their causal diagrams directly, which we've observed just isn't often the case among domain experts. And so our goal with Artisan is to bridge this gap between conceptual modeling and statistical modeling. And in order to do so, we need to answer two key research questions. The first is around what are usable abstractions, or what are approachable programming interfaces that allow domain experts to externalize their implicit domain knowledge? And then what's the impact of actually using these conceptual models to drive the statistical modeling process? And so Artisan is an interactive system that provides a domain-specific language, or a DSL, that's implemented as an R library, as well as an interactive two-phase disambiguation process. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of what the DSL looks like, there are three key sets of language constructs. First, for specifying one's variables of interest. Second, for specifying conceptual relationships between those variables. And then third, a query asking for the average causal effect of a specific variable on an outcome variable. And so for here, I'm just going to focus on this conceptual relationships, or how we develop a conceptual model. And just to remind us, the goal is to allow analysts to express their informal conceptual models and then be able to derive or distill a formal causal diagram from what they express that we can then use to derive statistical models to answer their motivating research questions. So we designed this DSL and these language constructs here with domain experts through a series of lab studies. And so I'm going to just highlight a couple of key kind of language constructs that we developed with those domain experts. And so one thing we observed among domain experts is that they don't often find it very comfortable or are ready to commit to a causal statement. Right. So instead, they want to specify something like they believe that there's some relationship between two variables, for example, between education and income. But throughout the analysis process, they need an ability to actually reflect on and refine what that direction is. And so they want to specify some ambiguity that they then later resolve. And so our DSL supports this by providing a construct called relates, and that allows analysts to specify additional optional annotations. For example, here specifying that there's some relationship in the increase of education and this increase of income. And so this came from a researcher who described how in his field, when they have bidirectional relationships, how he's thinking about this is as a middleman complex system with an underlying process that he needs to reconsider and consider alternatives for as he continues with data analysis. And so to support this reflective process, Artisan will reflect back the conceptual graph that the analyst has specified and provide a few options for how they might want to disambiguate that ambiguous relationship. And so here the analyst can specify that they want to assume that education actually influences income and see what the statistical model and results look like based on that assumption. Once they do that, then Artisan's internal representation of the conceptual model is updated, and then we can now use statistical best practices and recommendations for deriving statistical models from that formal conceptual model. And the output is a statistical model such as the one shown here, which accurately estimates the influence of a variable of interest here, employment, on income, as well as is guaranteed to represent the domain knowledge that the analyst has expressed in their input program. So we've evaluated Artisan in a number of ways, both in the lab and in the wild. And one of the key takeaways from that work is that Artisan helps structure not only the statistical authoring process by engaging analysts, enabling them to think more deeply about their domain and reconsider their assumptions, but also improves the statistical models that are output from that process. So that models actually have higher AIC and BIC scores, and they're actually very useful for iterating on, even for statistical experts. And so in ongoing work, we're really interested to look at how we can use conceptual models or similar representations to better understand and improve scientific reproducibility by representing key scientific claims and similar kinds of models that allow us to check and compare different claims across different papers and analysts. So with that, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. As a physicist by training, I'm very excited to hear that the multiverse is I'm sure there are questions.
Hi, thanks for that wonderful talk. I'm curious if you've had feedback from folks beyond kind of the early validation users of your usability studies, and I know that your labs are incredibly careful with that, but as these tools make their way kind of like into more everyday practice, what kind of feedback do you have in the messiness of a real world long-winded research project where these choices of model tend to get made like along the way of many other things? How does this kind of more structured process play with that messiness, if you will, of the ongoing changes of a research project?
Yeah, so I'll speak to that based on the long-term collaboration I had with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle. And what was really interesting was that those scientists and analysts, of course, are very skilled in what they're doing in their domain in statistics. And what they really wanted to do was use tools like Artisan as like kind of the last validation step in their models before actually writing up and releasing and submitting a publication about that. So it kind of started to make us think about what is like the larger ecosystem for not just model authoring, but also for model checking. And so they found the ability to be able to kind of reproduce essentially what this whole messy process looked like in a more formal and structured way as sort of a check mark of like, okay, we're good. And like, this is a sanity check for us to be able to then move forward with our conclusions and policy recommendations. Yeah, great question.
There's one more question in the back.
Thank you for this work and this talk. This looks really, really exciting. I find myself wondering, I think maybe you partially addressed this actually, but I want to ask anyway. I find myself wondering whether people in practice get limited by the combinatorial explosion of possible paths that they could go down and are ultimately limited by computation? Or do you find when people actually work like that doesn't actually end up being a problem in practice? Where does the set of combinations stop?
Yeah, so none of the teams that we are aware of who have used BOBA or multiverse debugger have run into computational issues. We have, Yang Liu actually developed a sampling kind of method and like extension to BOBA that helps to reduce that problem if that problem should arise. But there haven't been any like anecdotes in the wild whether that's been a problem. What I see as a problem is actually that analysts will perform or write their own basically like meta programs for writing a multiverse analysis even before they realize that they're authoring a multiverse analysis. And so then the challenge becomes, how do we take all of the code that they've written and then port it into this kind of framework that helps them to analyze the results, for example, through the visualization interface, or if necessary in the future to take advantage of the sampling module.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
There's one more question on the right.
Thanks for the great talk. Maybe a little bit follow up on the previous two questions. Just in my experience, many of your data analysis are kind of exploratory. It's kind of fun part of data analysis, particularly higher dimensional data. You want to find the latent variables, and then you want to understand the data. So it's really hard to make it more explicit what step to take. I'm not sure there's probably any comments. Maybe this is designed for a different purpose, or there's plan to adapt or expand.
Yeah, so you're asking about, could these tools be used in an exploratory setting, or what are their limitations for use in an exploratory setting, right? So certainly like modeling is a very exploratory process. These tools are very much designed for once you have done some initial exploration and you're willing to kind of commit to a number of analysis decisions and options, for example, how could you kind of do that? One way in which we've observed analysts try to do exploratory modeling is to kind of sketch out some initial analysis decisions. But then what we've also observed is that some of this additional structure can start to feel cumbersome for exploration. And so there's some open questions of like, how could you support some of this messy exploration and then allow analysts to extract kind of automatically some of the key analysis decisions or options, or even kind of assumptions that they're willing to make in their domain later on. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. There was one already the man with the yellow sweater. Yeah.
Yesterday, I just watched the movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and this somewhat reminded me of that.
Yeah.
So, how do the users actually specify all the possible scenarios? Like when they actually use it, do they need to put basically a lot more work than normal?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on kind of what your normal kind of analysis process is, right? For folks who are already doing this in their own scripts, like writing the specific options isn't necessarily more lines of code. But like a key challenge, right, that's motivated the work on Artisan is that like actually to be able to write a reasonable or justifiable kind of multiverse analysis takes quite a lot of time and effort to have to think about the analysis options at every point. And so the goal was to be able to say like, could we start with an analysis intent that an analyst has and then generate that multiverse for them, or to actually bootstrap that process, or to help them kind of suggest options. So we haven't explored sort of this the end-to-end kind of connecting Artisan with Boba, for example, but some ongoing work that Ken is actually doing is looking at how could you provide some sort of assistance, either through like using AI agents or alternative kind of data mining techniques to suggest options and alternatives when authoring multiverse, so that the analyst isn't required to basically write 1,000 analysis paths in one sitting, right?
But now it's like they have to manually specify. Or
At this point with Boba, they would have to manually specify. Yeah.
Okay.
And then Artisan on the back end generates a multiverse analysis anyway that it then prunes, but we could not do that pruning process.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions.
Thank you for the interesting questions. So we want to thank the speaker again.